Fantastic. I'm so excited for group life. And with the groups, we will have 4 groups altogether. 2 of them are, we're calling them kind of like curriculum groups, and they were the ones that we spoke about today, and the other ones are social groups. So you can actually, if it suits your schedule, if you want to go for one social and one curriculum, that's up to you. Or if you even want to go for both of the, probably not both social ones, but if you want to do more, you can, but just watch out for your time. What we're doing to the groups is that we would like you, especially for the curriculum groups, we are going to be closing them. That means that once it's signed up, we're not going to be adding people, just so that that group can really get to know each other, find a safe place that you can share, and know that this week we're not going to have new people coming in. What's it going to be like? But you know the people there, you get to know them really well over the 10 weeks, and that's going to be fantastic. And so we do need you to be signing up early on, so talk to them about it in the foyer today. There's going to be lots more information over the coming weeks so you can make your mind up about what's going on. But just touching on what Beck was talking about, we have actually got these Next Steps cards. If you're new, by the way, you should have received one of these in the foyer. If you haven't, we'll make sure you get one of them later. But as you can see, one of the cards is actually called Next Steps, and one of the next steps is the growth track. So if you've been coming to Lift, you've never been to a growth track before, it is something that we highly recommend. In fact, because we've never run a growth track before, no one's been to the growth track before. And we understand that we're looking for about 10 people all together, and we will be sharing about a bit more about Lift, and then go on to the SHAPE curriculum, which is really exciting. The reason why we put SHAPE together with the growth track and saying that this is a next step for every person is because I heard this crazy statistic that there are 87% of Christians never find a God-given gifting. 87%. That means close to 9 out of 10 people would never actually get that solid confidence that God has created me for this. And that's something that we really want to address early on in the journey, and that's why we want to do that. But for those who are also looking to start up your Bible reading habit, the Project 73 group's also fantastic. So I love both those groups and really hope that we get most of our church, not all of our church, involved in one of these groups in one way or another. That would be fantastic. Well, another thing that I do need to bring to your attention this morning is that we are actually going to be doing baptisms in 2 weeks' time. There's no better time than to get baptized in summer. Let me just advise you on that. We might be running one mid-year, but you're not going to enjoy that quite as much when the water is at about freezing temperature. I've been there. It is not fun. Maybe this time around, being the lead pastor, I can say, Mitch, you're going in the water in July. He's already white, so you won't see him like losing his color. Just joking. Is that a bird? That's all good. But we are doing baptism in a couple of weeks, and together with baptisms, we're actually going to be doing a bit of a family picnic. So we're going down to Leighton Beach. So after our Sunday experience on the 31st, we will pack down and we'll head down to Leighton. There's going to be a free sausage sizzle for every person that's coming, and from there we'll be baptizing people. There have been quite a few people interested in the baptisms, and that really excites us because baptisms are really a commandment from Jesus. So if you've never been baptized before and you have a relationship with Jesus, this is an essential next step. And we can explain it a lot more with you in the foyer at the end of our experience, because we want to make sure that you understand why baptism is important. We've got these little info sheets for you that we will just talk through with you. And so we're really excited about it. And if you have been baptized before, can we just ask that you put time aside to come along with us to celebrate these people that are making this public declaration? It is so exciting. I can't wait for the day that we are going to be baptizing like hundreds of people and all that kind of stuff. That's going to be so cool. But this first one I know is going to be a landmark. It's going to be something that we remember for the rest of our time, because it's the first baptism ever that we are doing. That never happens again. You know, we can probably say something like, it's our first baptism in a spa, or it's the first baptism, but it's not going to be the same as our first baptism ever. So we will love you to be there. We're going to feed you, we're bribing you, basically, so you have to come. And we'll love you to come along for that. Well, I've taken enough of my message time, and we're halfway through our Disrupt series, and I hope that you've been enjoying it. It's been something that's a really key series in setting us up for this year. Remember that our word is consecrate, and consecration is not about cleansing, but is more about that heart being sold out to God, saying yes to God, which sometimes means saying no to other things that the world throws at us. And this week, I'm really excited because I know the last couple of weeks I've probably been getting a little bit negative and saying, oh, don't do that, don't do that. And that's kind of what happens when you're talking about disrupt. But today, I really want to talk about something a little bit more happy, that people will probably like me a little bit more for this. But I want to talk about the whole idea of promotion. You see, at our last Pound of Ground prayer meeting, yes, we got really crazy names, we love it. But our Pound of Ground prayer meeting on Wednesday night, as we were praying, God really put this sense in my heart that He wants to bring promotion to people in our church. It was confirmed by people around, and as we were praying, we really sensed that God's opening up a season of promotion. But that wasn't all that there was, though, because God was also probably showing us more that we need to get ready for that season of promotion. And I know that every person here desires promotion. Promotion not necessarily in the job sense, even though some of you are looking for that, but probably we think about promotion as a breakthrough. It's like you've hit this ceiling and you know, things are not going anywhere in that area of your life. It might be in terms of your marriage. It might be in terms of a certain relationship that you have. It might be in terms of your job, or it might be in terms of what you feel God's called you to, and you've hit that ceiling. And a promotion is kind of that God-given thing where it takes us beyond that ceiling. And I know that that's something that all of us desire in our hearts. No one desires to live life stagnant. All of us want to get to that next level. And God is showing me that He wants to bring that into our lives. But we have to be ready for promotion. If we are not ready for the more that God has got for us, then He doesn't know whether He can trust us with that. And so God's showing me that we need to get ready. And that's part of the whole idea of being consecrated. Consecration gets us ready for a move of God. And this week we want to focus in on something that we need to do to get ready for promotion. And to probably help you see how this fits into the whole idea of disrupting the status quo, I've got this really sad story, to be honest, a really terrible story, but it so shows us what is going on in our world. 2 years ago, December 2013, there was a 16-year-old boy in Texas. His name was Ethan Couch. And Ethan Couch basically got drunk, drove his ute, and killed 4 people. And in the process of doing so, he flips his ute, and in the tray of his ute, he had 2 of his teenage friends. One of them was sent into intensive care with a broken spine, and it was a terrible story. That's him at that time. He was 16. And the thing about that is that, unfortunately, something like that happens quite often in our world. And it's terrible because we feel like such loss of life is irresponsible. Such loss of life is so tragic when it could have been avoided. He was found to have 3 times the blood alcohol limit at 0.25. And so he went to juvenile court, they went through proceedings, and that's when this actually blew up in the media. Because his defense team called a psychologist to be an expert witness. And during this proceedings, this psychologist coined a term that is not actually a real mental illness, but he basically said this boy was going through this situation and has a problem, and he called it affluenza. You can see it at the bottom there. He's a victim of affluenza. Now, affluenza sounds really cool. It's like, if it means becoming affluent, I would love to catch affluenza. Anyone here want to catch affluenza? It's not actually that nice. What basically affluenza means is that this boy has been growing up in so much affluence. He has everything that he needed. His parents are divorced, but they always gave him exactly what he wanted whenever he wanted. There were no boundaries and no responsibilities. And the crazy thing about it is that this psychologist was saying that at the age of 16, this idea of affluenza almost becomes irreversible. I was like, what's that word? irreversible. And the psychologist actually recommended that Ethan be separated from his mum, with whom he was living with, and being put in intensive rehab so that the symptoms of affluenza would be able to be reversed. How crazy is that? Now, the judge seemed to think that there was some weight to this argument, and so Ethan was given 10 years probation. During that time, if he was ever caught drinking or taking drugs, he would then be put to jail. But before then, all he needed to do was go through rehab and stay dry. It was basically all the judge really asked from this 16-year-old boy. And just as a little note, his rehab cost $450,000. I would love to be able to have that kind of cash to spend on rehab, if you know what I mean. That's crazy that he had all that kind of stuff. And it's a really tragic story. And it makes me think, how is it possible that we've gotten to this stage where a boy who kills people would go to court, show no remorse whatsoever, and be told that and his defense is that he's never had responsibility placed on his life before. And I'm wondering whether being in an affluent society today, maybe we don't have affluenza to the extent of this case, but maybe some of us have got something going on the inside of us that says that is not my responsibility. The case doesn't actually stop there. It was brought back into the media again recently in December 2015, just a month ago. And what had happened was that there was a picture taken of Ethan drinking alcohol, just 2 years into his probation. So the cops investigated. They couldn't find him. He had gone missing, and so had his mum. So it sparked an international manhunt, and they found him in Mexico. And when they found him, they caught him, brought him back. And this is a story. His mum couldn't take that her boy couldn't live the life that he wanted. And so took him and tried to escape from a place and start afresh and not have to deal with the consequences of his previous actions. She even threw a going away party for this boy, where there was alcohol. And I'm wondering whether some of us live in a way where we think that, we would condemn something like this. We would look at this case, we would hear the facts of what happened, and we'd go, what is this world becoming? But I'm wondering whether there are little symptoms of affluenza coming into our lives, where we don't actually know how to take responsibility for our actions. And in the Bible, right from the start to the finish, we see case after case after case of people that don't know how to take responsibility for their actions and end up either stagnating or going backwards in their life. Right in the start of the Bible, we hear the story about two brothers. Their names are Cain and Abel. You have read about them if you're following Project 73. And these two brothers were basically the first siblings in the world. And these Cain was a farmer, and Abel was a hunter. I think so. No, he was like a shepherd type person. So one looked after plants, one looked after animals. Basically, I don't know what they're called. I've got affluenza, I'm sorry. I just buy this stuff from the supermarket. We try growing veggies, that doesn't work for us. We don't know what we're doing. But anyway, they decided to bring a sacrifice to God, and Abel actually brings the best of his flock to sacrifice to God, whereas Cain only brings just whatever leftovers he had. And so God, obviously, looks with favor upon Abel's offering, but on Cain's offering he rejects. This stirs up jealousy in Cain, and so he kills his brother. And when God went to investigate what was going on, God said to Cain, and we see this in Genesis 4 verse 9, then the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? Basically, he was saying, that is not my responsibility. The actions that I took was not my responsibility. And the consequences of that thought of not taking responsibility was that Cain was to be a wanderer for the rest of his life, never being settled, never having the desires of his heart. He would have to go from place to place, be subject to the people that he was around, and he never found the place where God would have wanted him. And so with that in mind, there are plenty of other examples in the Bible. Maybe you can think of King Saul or so many people that didn't take responsibility for their actions and never ended up receiving the fullness of what God had got for them. But instead of dwelling on the negative today, I want to dwell on the positive. I know the last couple of weeks we've been taking negative examples, but today I want to look at Joseph, the life of Joseph. Many of us love Joseph. He is a great guy. He was the second youngest of 12 brothers. We always know that 12 brothers is always going to be trouble. And so Joseph had a lot of trouble with his brothers. And a part of it is because he was an upright man. He had honesty flowing out of his bones, so much so that once he dobbed in his brothers to his dad, which we in Australia we don't like, but, to be honest, is a good thing. And so his brothers didn't really like him, and on top of that, he actually got this dream that he was going to become a ruler that was so honored that his family would actually bow down to him. That didn't help the brothers to like him anymore when he shared that story. But at the same time, his dad saw that there was something special about this boy. He was the favored child. That was all to change, though, because what happened is that his brothers came and they sold him into slavery. A terrible thing. And he went all the way to Egypt, where he was sold to a person named Potiphar, and he was just going to have to deal with that circumstance thrown at him in his life. I'm wondering whether some of us, we got this dream from God. We think that God has put something on our heart, and then circumstances actually go the opposite direction, and we sometimes question, where's God in all of this? I'm sure that those kind of thoughts would have occurred to Joseph's mind. But when he was serving as a slave, he actually did all that he was given to do. He did it so well that Potiphar actually promoted him to be in charge of his whole house. If you just think about the emotions that Joseph would have gone through, favored son, being given a dream of rulership, going into slavery, probably the lowest point of his life so far. And then as he continues to work his way through life, he finds promotion. Being in charge of a rich man's house is probably a good thing. In that society, he would probably have been seen as a respectable man, even though he was a slave. But at least he has got a good job and probably has all of his needs well met. And maybe he was thinking, this is a good turning point in my life. Unfortunately, there was another turning point to come that wasn't so nice. Potiphar's wife propositions him, and being a good, upright man, he declines that. He runs away from that situation. But in the process of doing so, finds that Potiphar's wife had actually framed him and said that he was trying to rape her, and so Potiphar throws him in jail. Now, I know I told you that this was supposed to be a good example. And right now you're probably thinking, if my life looks anything like that man, I don't want what God has got for me. Yeah? And then you want to read that story and go like, if to become that, I have to go through slavery and wrongful accusation and being thrown in jail, that really sucks. Again, we don't know exactly how Joseph would have been dealing with that issue of being wrongfully accused and being thrown in jail. And the thing about this is that it looked like it was an indefinite sentence. For many of us in Western society, at least right from the start, you know how long you're going to be in jail. You've got 5-year sentence, 20-year sentence. You've got something to count down, something to look forward to. In those days, I don't know if there was such a sentence, but Joseph probably didn't ever know when he was going to be set free from that jail. That was going to be his new reality. That was going to be all of his life. And if I was Joseph, I would have thrown a towel in thinking that this is impossible to deal with. I remember when I was getting ready to go to the army, 2 years in the army seemed way too long for me. I hated the idea of it. I thought it was kind of like a mini death sentence for me. But 2 years at least, I knew that there was an end point. And when I'd gone through a year and a half, it was really like the light at the end of the tunnel was coming to me. But if I was being told you have to do this, and I'm not going to tell you how long it was, the mental trauma of not knowing when this would end is ridiculous. I would probably have given up on hope. But Joseph did differently. Once again, he took on whatever responsibility he was given. He did it so well that the guards actually made him in charge of all the prisoners. Again, he made the best of the situation that he was in, getting to a point where it probably got as good as it gets, where he was probably given a certain amount of freedom. And I'm wondering how many of us has that mental fortitude, that strength in us to actually make the best of the situations that we are in. Because maybe that's what God is wanting to see in us. How do we handle such circumstances? Do we know how to continue to rely and trust in Him? It was 11 years that he was in prison before there seemed to be a glimmer of hope. 11 years. 11 long years of not knowing anything. And then 2 of the prisoners have dreams, and they were dreams that really disturbed him. He didn't know, the 2 prisoners didn't know what to do about it. They were talking about it, and Joseph comes along and he says, God's given me this ability to interpret dreams, so tell me your dreams and I'll help you with it. The 2 prisoners used to serve under Pharaoh. One of them was a baker, and the other one was a cupbearer. Unfortunately for the baker, his dream meant he was going to get executed. Probably not a dream you want interpreted, if you ask me. But he dies, but the cupbearer, as according to Joseph's interpretation, gets reinstated. And at that point, Joseph told the cupbearer, when you get out of here, remember me. Remember me. It shows me that Joseph hadn't given up on hope. Joseph still thought that there was a way out of this situation, that God is still orchestrating things. Maybe God orchestrated this event for me to overhear that they were talking about these dreams and for me to be able to help them. Hopefully this is going to be the end of this stuff that is happening to me. And it was, but it would take another 2 years. Joseph spent 13 years in jail for an action he never did. Wrongfully accused, forgotten, thrown in a place where he was so far away from what God had promised him at the start. But at the end of those 2 years, now remember, he doesn't know that this is going to happen. But Pharaoh has a dream this time, and no one could interpret it. And the cupbearer remembers Joseph 2 years later. Finally, oh yeah, that was that guy who told me to remember him. If you have a friend like that, drop him. But he remembers. And at that point, he says, I remember that there was a man who interpreted my dream while I was in jail. His name is Joseph. So Pharaoh calls Joseph out, and Joseph interprets the dream. Now, this dream was that there was going to be 7 bountiful years of harvest, followed by 7 years of famine that will ravage the whole earth. And so Joseph interprets the dream, and not just interprets it, but he actually has a strategy that God gave him on how to handle this famine that was upcoming, that would also make Egypt a world power at that time. And so Pharaoh sees that there's something different about this man, and makes Joseph the second in command of the whole nation. He just went from jail to second in command of the whole earth. Now, many of us would think that promotion looks like that. That our promotion is going to look like I'm right down at this point, and God's going to bring me my promotion, and it's going to look like that. I think probably the course of our life could mirror Joseph somewhat, maybe not to the extent that he did, but few of us are going to become second in command of a nation. So let's put that off our mind. But with what God has given to us, maybe promotion looks like God getting us ready for that next phase. That looks like it's going down in terms of what the world is would say. And remember, Joseph went into slavery, wrongfully accused, and went into jail for 13 years. And if you are willing to go through that to get to that point of being second in command, then maybe you are ready for that promotion. But Joseph's full dream comes into fruition when his brothers during the famine have to come to Egypt to buy food. Finally, they come to him, and not knowing who this man was, because remember, it was probably close to 2 decades. They've not seen their brother for 2 decades. And at this point, they don't recognize him. He's probably got a nice tan from living in Egypt. As we know, we have an Egyptian in our midst. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Just gone, just like that. And they bow to him as a fulfillment of what God had told him when he was a teenager. And through this story, I find 2 things that we need to learn how to be responsible for. 2 things that in every circumstance, in every situation, if we learn how to be responsible for these 2 things, I believe that most other things are going to come into place. And these 2 things, you ready for it? These 2 things are so important. These 2 things will guard us from affluenza. These 2 things will help us to be ready for promotion. You ready? Cool. 1 person. Fantastic. The first thing is our intimacy with God. We need to be responsible for our intimacy with God. All through Joseph's story, there was this little line that says, God was with him and gave him favor. God was with him and gave him favor. He was at home. God was with him, gave him favor. He was a slave. God was with him and gave him favor. He was in jail. God was with him and gave him favor. At that point, I thought, maybe God was just trying to compensate for all the bad stuff that he had thrown Joseph's way. You know, if you think about it that way, it's like, man, God, what are you doing? And God says, okay, it's been a rough ride. Here, have some favor. Have some of my presence. Like, it was like God was compensating for the fact that it was a situation that no one would want to find themselves in. But as I thought about it, I recognize that many of us as human beings, we've got a very short-term viewpoint of life. We're thinking about the situation that we're in right now. Whereas God has a massive view of our life, not just our life on earth, but eternity as well. And God knew what was going to come later. God didn't need to compensate for anything because he was taking Joseph through a journey of great promotion that only God could bring about in his life. God wasn't trying to compensate for the fact that Joseph was in a difficult situation. No, God was actually with him because Joseph stuck with him. If you remember the verse that we had at the start of our series in John 15 verse 7, it says, abide in me and I will abide in you. That's the kind of life that we need to understand, that it is a two-way street. God doesn't just come to you and stand behind you the whole time and he's like, I'm with you, I'm with you, I'm with you. No, it takes a two-way street where we turn to God and we say to God, God, I'm abiding in you and you will abide with me. And therefore, when you get to that point, then whatever you ask for, whatever you wish will be done for you. We talked about that. And I think it's important to note that Joseph probably understood that it was his responsibility for his intimacy with God. It wasn't God's responsibility to come and show up and to give him all these things that he was asking for. No, he was willing to go through each and every circumstance, but he continued to abide in God and continued to have God standing beside him. How many of us are actually responsible for our intimacy with God? How many of us are actually taking charge of that area of our life where we say to God, God, you're the only relationship that really, 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 really matters and is something that I'm willing to invest into, is something that I'm going to sow into? How many of us, even in good times when things are going well and God's giving you everything that you want, you are in a place where you are responsible for your intimacy with God? Or how many of us are taking it for granted? And maybe we're thinking that, no, God needs to come to me. I'm going to throw this on God. And we sometimes interpret our circumstance and our situations as where God is in our lives. Well, the Bible tells us that God says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Even though you go through the valley of the shadow of death, God is with you. But it doesn't say, I will never lead you through the valley of shadow of death. It says, as you go through it. Some of us need to think and rethink about our relationship with God and what we think it means. 2 Corinthians 12:7-9 says this. This is Paul the Apostle writing. And Paul was a fantastic a man of God. He went through so many situations. He went through shipwrecks. He went through whippings to an inch of his life. And yet he still continued to serve God. And yet this is what he says in 2 Corinthians 12. He says, so to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh. Now I learned something. When we think of this word thorn, we think of this little rose bush and maybe a thorn, maybe as big as that. A thorn in the Greek actually means a stake, something that you drive through, something that is big. You think about a javelin being thrown your way. That is the kind of pain that Paul was talking about. A thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, and therefore I will take this pain away. No, that's not what the Bible says, yet we think that way. We love quoting, oh, God's grace is sufficient for you. He's going to take that thing away. No, it says, and my power is made perfect in weakness. And therefore I will boast all the more in my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Now we need to understand this, because in this verse it talks about promotion. Paul was a man who wrote 3/4 of the New Testament, of the books in the New Testament. He had a revelation of God like no one else. Not even the disciples that walked with Jesus had that kind of revelation that Paul had, that he wrote down for us to remember today. And because of the great promotion that God had for this man, he also put a thorn in his flesh so that he would be able to carry the promotion. Think about it this way. He said, keep me from becoming conceited. Paul knew the moment he became proud was the moment the revelations would stop. Paul knew the moment he turned to himself and said, this came from me, was the moment God would say, you are no longer able to carry the surpassing revelations that I intended for you. Some of us in our lives have become conceited and have stopped taking responsibility of our lives and the things that are going on. And because we're saying, no, I want to have life this way. I want to be in control this way. And because of that, we are missing out on the surpassing greatness of what God has got for us. But Paul was saying the whole idea of God's grace being sufficient for me means that God will be with you no matter what. And our job is our responsibility is to keep that connection. Joseph dealt with so many issues in his life, more than any of us would probably face. But in the midst of all of them, he continued to hold his head up, and I believe that was because he knew that his intimacy with God was the foremost responsibility in his life. But there was something else that he did really well as well, and that he was responsible for his thoughts. Joseph was responsible for his thoughts. I find that in my life, when things are getting terrible or I'm faced with temptation and you know that something's drawing me into something dark, that often starts with that little thought. That little seed thought. Maybe is a hurt. Maybe is a little bit of bitterness. Maybe is just a desire, a sinful desire in your life. It starts as a thought, and as we continue to think about it, it kind of becomes bigger and bigger until you can't actually push it away anymore. It's so in our face that it's all that we think about. I think for Joseph, when he was first made a slave, I'm wondering whether he would have had that kind of a thought life where it was drawn into such darkness. And then when he was thrown in jail for 13 years, as I was talking about, I'm wondering, how did he manage to be in control of his thoughts? How is it that he didn't become this depressed, a broken person? How is it that he came out on the other side and didn't smell or smoke? He even said these things to his brothers when he finally met up with them. He says in Genesis 45:4-7, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt, and now do not be distressed or angry of yourself because you sold me here, for God sent me here to preserve life. A little bit later, he says a very similar thing in Genesis 50, verse 20. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive. In the midst of his most terrible time in his life, he still continued to replace the thoughts of evil being done against him, thoughts of revenge, thoughts of bitterness, thoughts of hurt. All of those thoughts, he replaced it with a thought that God is using me for something. And many of us in our lives, we have stopped taking responsibility for our thoughts. Many of us are in a position where our thought life, we just let it run. We are no longer aware of the thoughts and the pattern of thoughts that we have in our lives, and is drawing us down. But the Bible tells us in 2 Corinthians 10 verse 5, we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ. I believe that the main reason why Joseph could walk out of jail after 13 years and all the stuff he'd experienced and still be able to say, God used what was intended for evil, turned it for good, and saved lives in the process. And I'm happy to have gone through all of that. The only way he could have done that is to not allow the lies of the enemy, the thoughts of the enemy, to take root and to actually start to dictate to him his behaviors, his actions, and his emotions. Too many young people nowadays, I know through this series we hit up young people a fair bit. That's because that's something that I have worked with as a youth pastor previously. And young people, you are a product of today's generation. Well, you live in today's generation. And you have to be aware of what is going on. So many young people, and I would say also older people, because I've seen them, to be honest. Sometimes old people are just young people, but old. The same people. Totally made sense, didn't it? But we're not taking responsibility for our thoughts. We're letting the smallest things set us off. We're letting the smallest things draw us into situations that we should never be found. I remember as a youth pastor, there was one Friday night after youth, we had dropped some of the teens off, and we're heading to Macca's because that's what every good youth pastor and good youth team would do, have Macca's. And on the way to Macca's, as we were driving, got this phone call from one of our team, and this girl, fantastic leader, she pulls up and says, Nate, one of the girls has just threatened suicide. Unfortunately, it was an all too common occurrence when we were leading a youth group that young people nowadays just think suicide is their way out. And so we were just trying to ascertain where she was at and what was going on. And so we got to this question like, what triggered this off? And the answer blew my mind away. She said that her dad didn't want to get her a new hairdryer. And therefore, she was willing to take a life. That doesn't happen overnight, people. That kind of thought process doesn't happen overnight. But this girl was never taught to be responsible for her thought life. That when I don't get what I want, it doesn't matter. No one told her, when you have that kind of a thought process in your mind, you can replace it. You can have a brand new way of thinking. You can take that thought and you can subject it to what Christ is saying in your life. No, this girl had always been taught just to take whatever thoughts was in her mind, allow it to become the reality that you live in, and therefore just behave in the way that you think you should. And so for her, the moment she didn't get what she wanted, it was an indication of her worth. It was an indication of the Father's love for her. It was an indication that life was hopeless. And even though we on the outside think how sad to be in that place, how many of us have got thought processes that are taking us into dark places, and we have not taken responsibility for our thoughts? I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying we just say the magic word stop and it stops. But many of us need to take responsibility now and to start replacing those thoughts of bitterness, of hurt, of temptation, of desires that we know are not right in our life. Because if we don't learn how to take responsibility of our thoughts, we won't be ready for the promotion when it comes.
And so to help us remember, I know it's only 2 points, but I thought this is a really clever thing, so go with me on this. But we need to take responsibility for our intimacy with God and our thoughts. And so we need to learn how to own it. That's my title of the message. I own it. Intimacy with God and my thoughts. Whenever things are gone terrible, difficult, whatever situation you find yourself in, I own it. I own it. I own it. Those are the 2 things that are consistent throughout your life. No one else can do these things for you. No one else. I can be the best pastor in the world and you can have the worst relationship with God. I cannot own your intimacy with God. That is your responsibility. And I cannot go into your thoughts. I train as a psychologist. I cannot read your thoughts and I cannot replace the thoughts for you. Just truth, all right? Sometimes you come to church and you think Pastor Nate's going to give me that magic pill and change my life around. No, I cannot do that. And in fact, God is saying you are not ready for promotion. You are not ready for the breakthrough, because when the breakthrough comes, you still do not have responsibility of your thought life. You still do not have responsibility over your relationship with me. But if we learn today to own it, and I was reading this blog. I love following this guy. His name is Dr. Tim Elmore. And he was the one that highlighted the case of Ethan Couch to me. And he wrote that if we don't change this around, this whole idea of us being responsible in our life, world is going to go into chaos. The next generation doesn't know how to deal with this stuff. He said the biggest thing that will turn this around is ownership. Is ownership. How many of us own our intimacy with God? How many of us are owning the thoughts that are going through our head? I've been there before where I feel like I'm not in control of my thoughts. Where I feel like I'm trying to search after God, but I still can't find Him. Are we going to allow the circumstance to dictate to us how we deal with those things in our lives? Because no one else can be responsible for them other than you. So this morning, as we get the band up, promotion is around the corner. We don't always know when. We don't always know how. You know, your promotion might be 13 years away, but you are getting ready for that process today. You have to. Through that 13 years that Joseph was in jail, I don't know exactly what God was trying to do. But one thing I know is that God was positioning him and getting him ready to become the second in command of a whole nation that would save a whole generation of people across the world. The smallness of your situation that you find yourself in right now really becomes clear to us when we step out of it. And I know that there's some people in this room this morning that your situation seems so hopeless, it seems so depressing, it seems like God has just kind of thrown you down another level. And when you hear me talk about promotion, you're like, yeah, that's for that other person. I'm stuck in this place. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what God has got for me. Well, that dream that God has put in your heart is not supposed to diminish over time. It's just waiting for that perfect appointed time that God has got for your life. But in the middle of waiting, we've got to learn how to own it. We've got to learn how to take responsibility for it.